When I first started transitioning, I was largely unaware of how my racial identity intersected with my other identities. I didn't have feelings at the time about being a Black girl, and after I transitioned, I didn't really have feelings about being a Black man. But that changed after the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd's murder really awakened me to a reality that I think I had been trying to escape, a fact that by simply being myself, I was at risk. I talk openly about my experiences during undergrad and the impact they had on mental health. I think those experiences were compounded for me, not only because I was in constant fear due to the color of my skin, but also because I was in constant fear because of my gender identity. But with that being said, the reckoning I had been trying to avoid has since taught me that beauty and pain are intertwined in the fabric of who I am. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about this intersectionality piece, because it helps people realize that no matter what their identities are, there is beauty in the pain.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Gibbs, and I serve as the Minister of Youth and College Students here at Myers Park Baptist Church. I also identify as a Black bisexual woman. Just a little bit about some of my story is that I grew up in the church, predominantly Black churches. Those are the churches that my families were a part of. And while I didn't get the kind of homophobic bashing that many people in the South, I'm originally from rural town, North Carolina, get, I still was part of the real passive kind of, we'll do no harm, but that's not God's best for people. It wasn't until around 2015 where I had an opportunity to go to an LGBTQ plus faith meetup group, support group at Princeton University. And it was there I went as someone who was through seminary trying to learn to be a good pastor, trying to learn those skills, and I knew that there were people, whether I agreed or not, being LGBTQ plus, that I needed to know how to minister to and support. It was there that I heard a number of personal stories that brought me to tears. And it's out of that, the very first meeting, I kept going back for some time, but it was after the very first meeting that I realized I had a righteous indignation. I was pissed that so many of my peers, people my own age, younger, had stories of their own supposed faith communities harming them, hating them, and condemning them to hell. And I knew that was not God's love. And so that's where led me and helped me in my own identity to come out as a bisexual woman around 2019. My passion is Christian education. I'm all about educating people who say they subscribe to Christianity to be better Christians. It was by coming out as bisexual where I realized I've always identified as a Black woman, but what does it mean to add this plus, this queerness, this and to it? And so just as Devin said, it's those moments where you start to realize that this intersection is something else. It's an and to so many other things. And when I realized how much other discrimination was out there and would start to affect me by being out, that I grew my own passion for talking about the intersection between faith and race. And what we're going to talk about today is primarily the intersection between the Christian faith and being Black.
So to start, I want to begin with a few quick definitions that we used to guide the creation of this presentation. And the first is minority stress theory. We talked a little bit about this in the first plenary session, but this is an idea by Ellen Meyer that describes chronically high levels of stress faced by members of stigmatized and marginalized groups. The stressors that these individuals face include interpersonal prejudice, discrimination, rejection, hate crimes, and hiding one's true identity. These stressors place these individuals at a higher risk for negative health outcomes, and we will talk about some of those health outcomes later. So you may have heard the name Kimberly Crenshaw. She is famous for her work around intersectionality, which is this idea that our identities are not independent, but interdependent. So at the beginning of the first plenary session, I named that I'm Jamaican. And the reason I did this is that my Jamaican heritage affects my experiences as a transgender person. So looking at our work through an intersectional framework is pivotal because it helps us understand experiences of racial stigma in LGBTQ plus spaces, as well as LGBTQ stigma in Black spaces. So many of us know what racism is, but something that's often not discussed is the fact that it really is a mental health issue. We know that racism causes trauma, and that compounded experiences of different forms of racism have been shown to increase anxiety and depression for those who experience it. These different forms of racism may not always be obvious. They may be systemic, such as inequalities in the criminal justice system. They may be in the form of microaggressions, or they may even be internalized.
So we're going to talk a little bit about that inner conflict or intergroup conflict. As someone who is Black and bi, that means that I experience both racism and homophobia. There are so many other phobias and things that are a part of this intersection, but the one I want to look up, Devin, I want to look up today is that there are many Black LGBTQ people, first of all, right? And that means that there's not only an intersection of identity, but there's an intersection of discrimination, right, and abuse. So one example is just a lack of representation in LGBTQ spaces. Many LGBTQ spaces are wonderfully open and affirming when it comes to sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression. However, when it starts to come to race, then we start to realize that there is still a lot of racism, there's a lot of xenophobia, there's still a lot of other work that still infiltrates into these spaces and can make it very difficult for someone who is Black or LGBTQ and Black and a different race other than white to feel included, to feel welcome, to feel a part of. However, the reverse is also true, right? There are plenty of spaces that are affirming of someone's racial identity, but as soon as you bring up anything that's not cis and straight, then there are issues. Some examples that we thought of were, did I go back? I didn't bring up my example, I'm sorry. This gay comedian Chuck Nip performed in blackface. And not just one time, this was his role. He had a character he made up, and the community said, oh, this is great support. It's an LGBTQ comedian that's out in front, but what does it mean for a Black person to see that this is the comedy? It has to be making fun of our racial experience but this is the person we're supposed to lift up. The reverse, or another example would be, some of you may have heard of James Charles, who is an influencer, has his own makeup line, things like that. Wonderful icon for what was considered the LGBT community, but really for the white LGBT community. He's been called out many times for his use of racial slurs and racial abuse, even while at one point dating someone who identified as Black. So again, what does that mean when he was getting deals from Maybelline L'Oreal for his makeup lines, when he has openly, and it was not hidden, that he was abusive and discriminatory towards Black people? So I'll go to the next slide now. Thank you. So let's go back to what it means to be LGBTQ plus in Black culture. Many of you are aware that, of course, first of all, we are not a monolith, period. However, in these United States, a good portion, the majority of Black persons would identify with some kind of religious leaning, most of which would be Christianity. Most is still not all. There are plenty of Black people of faith who are of a different faith other than Christianity. There are plenty of Black people who do not identify with organized religion or faith at all as well. However, due to some of the past and the histories of the Black church, the Black experience in America, thanks to that good old transatlantic slave trade, church is really strongly tied to, the Christian church is very strongly tied to Black culture. And there are plenty of pros to that, but there are also plenty of cons to that. So a lot of the values, unfortunately, preached in the Black church tend to be socially conservative, right? We can talk about it another time. I ain't got time for it today. But, I think it is still statistically true that most Black people or African Americans would vote Democrat, right? Or may vote what some consider to be more liberal. However, when you start picking out some of those individual issues, particularly as they relate to social and issues, then you start to see that a lot of Black Americans are actually very socially conservative. Devin has information on the next slide in just a moment. But the other point that he added up here is that another really obvious example is with HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, where wonderful Black representation, wonderful culture, wonderful history, Where are the LGBTQ people on the faces of their website, their brochures, their leadership roles, the board levels? I will highlight Spelman University Spelman College down in Atlanta, who in 2017 officially made it their policy to accept transgender women onto this campus where it is a all-women's college. And while that's something to applaud and be proud of, that was just in 2017. That was just a few years ago. And being permitted somewhere doesn't mean you're welcome. It doesn't mean you're included. It doesn't mean you belong. Okay? So let's look at a little bit of statistics here. So African Americans, again, more likely than most other racial groups to agree that same-sex marriage is a threat to traditional marriage. A lot of this has ties and roots back to the Black church. Okay? African Americans are less likely to be in favor of marriage equality. This is according to multiple polls and research. I do want to note here that, again, as I said, Black people, Black persons are not a monolith. Every Black person is not subscribed to what is considered the Black church. However, the Black church is not the root and the beginning of these ideas of homophobia. Ideas of homophobia are actually rooted in white supremacy, and again, was impacted by the transatlantic slave trade. Many Black persons in the United States assign themselves to the religion here, or some would say the religion of their oppressors, as a mechanism of safety, right? As long as they said they were Christian and identified and worshiped in such a way that white persons in power and leadership could see, it was the safe thing to do. Unfortunately, that led to an erasure of many of our Black historical icons. It also led to the erasure of traditional African religions that and languages that actually embraced more of a spectrum. Pre-colonial Africa, there were no terms for homophobia, homosexuality, but there were a myriad terms for things that we would consider to be non-binary, for things, relationships and sexualities that we would consider somewhere on the spectrum, more inclusive. So it's important to note that even though that is a reality today about the Black church and the rampant nature of homophobia, that is not inherent to Black culture. Amen.
Amen.
All right, I'm from the Black church. All right. So here's a little bit more statistics. So again, 1.2+ million adults in the United States identify as both Black and somewhere in the LGBTQ spectrum. That's a lot of people. It's enough people that we should be talking more about this intersection and what it means. The majority live in the South. It kind of irritates me personally when people start talking about either race issues or LGBTQ equality issues, and the first thing is, oh my gosh, those southern states. It's the southern states that are doing this, but it's also where we live, right? You can't just say, let's just cut off Florida. We live in Florida. We live in Mississippi. We live in Alabama. You cannot just cut these states off and pretend that, oh, we don't need them. They're all this way. There are people that are both Black and LGBTQ in these spaces, and we cannot afford to leave anyone behind. Okay? 30% between 18 and 24. We had a great time in our small group talking about youth and young people as it comes to LGBTQIA+ issues. And more than likely, it's the younger generation who thankfully do have more tools, they do have more language and more accessibility and acceptance to be able to talk about who they are and how they identify. But that also means they're the group that needs the most support, because there are other generations that do not understand and are outright hateful and harmful towards them. Just real quick, the more likely than Black non-LGBTQ people to be low income, despite comparable levels of college education. So we're starting to see, again, there are more intersections here when you start talking about race and sexuality or gender identity. More likely than white LGBTQ people to report discrimination in housing and in healthcare. What does it mean for, use myself for example, to go into the doctor's clinic and I first have to deal with the fact that they're looking at me as a Black woman, right? And then also when those questions come up about sex, and are you having sex with your male partner, and are you likely to be pregnant? And my partner, and I'm partnered with a non-binary femme-presenting person. No, I'm not pregnant. I promise you I'm not, right? more likely than Black non-LGBTQ people to experience at least one discriminatory event in the past year. Again, it seems common sense, but people seem to skip over this. Again, you show up somewhere Black and you deal with that discrimination. You show up somewhere LGBTQ, you deal with that discrimination. You have the audacity to live in your fullness of being Black and LGBTQ in some spaces, it's going to get worse. There's this discrimination and this discrimination, okay? Are there any questions at this point? Okay. Okay. So we mentioned a little bit about health, particularly when it comes to Black LGBTQ adults. And we're actually going to talk about AIDS and HIV a little bit too. So more likely than Black non-LGBTQ people to have asthma or cancer. This also starts to dive into some other intersections, right? How many of you are passionate about climate change, environmentalism, right? What do we talk about? Environmental racism, right? Where are the areas that are being most affected by capitalist desires to just wreck this world, right? It's more likely to be in low-income, predominantly Black neighborhoods. That also includes Black neighborhoods that have LGBTQ plus children, families, and adults. So, when you start trying to get access to healthcare, access to the medical care, and things like that, what does it mean when you show up to those spaces and, again, you have the audacity to be both Black and LGBTQ? Where are the resources that will help you at your intersection? Significantly higher rates of depression than Black non-LGBTQ people. I already struggled to find a Black therapist that I wanted for whatever, all my mental health struggles and journey of mental health, but then I needed a Black therapist that understood some of the LGBTQ plus issues, right? Because again, it's an intersection. I don't need one and the other. I need someone who understands both. And very recently, my partner and I struggled. We were planning on getting married, and we tried to find a couples counselor to counsel us, and it was hard to find someone, one who was not outright homophobic, one who was not outright racist, but then someone who was beyond that and actually prepared to deal with the questions and concerns we had. It's one thing to show up in that space and say, oh, no, you're good, you're loved, but then our session is spent with me trying to answer your question, therapist questions about the extra, these other letters on the end of LGBTQ. I'm paying you, right? We deserve support and healthcare, mental wellness, just like everyone else. Less likely to have insurance or a regular health provider. The disparities among Black LGBTQ women in particular. Many of you are already aware of the disparities that Black women in particular face in the medical arena. You add in the LGBTQ plus piece, it's another level of discrimination. Where are our advocates? Where are our representation? Where are doctors and nurses that look like us, right? Doctors and nurses who understand who we are. Even someone at the front desk, right, that's asking, I know you can't wait to get home to your husband, right? Or making comments, about skin tone and things that are those microaggressions that Devin mentioned. These are all aspects that someone who may identify as just Black and not LGBTQ, or someone who identifies as LGBTQ and not Black, may not understand. This happens over and over again.
One question, yeah.
Yes.
Black, the one about cancer and
Let's see.
asthma or cancer, is that implying that the Black LGBTQ people tend to are poorer? Is that what's going on there? Why is that? Do they know why that the health issue there?
Sure, there are a bunch of different studies, and I can probably get you some in a minute afterwards, but it really comes down, I think, to what I've read. It's not anything inherent to someone being Black or LGBTQ, it's the makeup of our nation and how we treat people who are Black and LGBTQ. So when you're already in an impoverished neighborhood, and we know, let's use Charlotte, right? Y'all remember the study, 10 plus years ago now? The chances of moving up in income. If you don't have insurance, so what if your kid has asthma? What are you going to do, right?
Right.
If you have cancer, what's the best way to prevent cancer? Screenings, early screenings, right? Great, your insurance does it for free every year. You don't have insurance. So then the cancer is discovered where? Stage 3, stage 4, maybe, luckily if you're lucky, right? So again, hopefully I'm answering your question, Tony. I don't think.
So the LGBTQ people but they're both black, but the black and LGBTQ have more cancer. And so what's the variable between the black?
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
This probably isn't written exactly correct. It's not just more, it's more likely or higher rates. So again, I talked a little bit about the disparities just being black and having to deal with asthma, cancer, and other medical issues, right? So the LGBTQ plus piece comes in with, okay, certain types of cancer. If you are black and you present in a way that is not on the binary, perhaps, is someone really going to ask a trans man, right? Or excuse me, a trans man about their reproductive health, right? Cervical cancer may be a concern. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So it all comes into play, and that's why it's so important that we have people like you all who are trying to understand and do better. Because otherwise we fall into making assumptions, we fall into stereotyping, and people are being ignored, and people are literally dying.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. Okay. So, this quote here from the Washington Post says, the rate of black Americans showing clinically significant signs of anxiety or depressive disorders jumped from 36 to 41% in the week after the video of George Floyd's death became public. So, as much as many of us were appalled to see that video, as it took us aback, as it hurt us, I'm sure many of you can only imagine, and you'll have to just empathize with those of us who identify as black, where it's not just that sad kind of thing. It's, am I next as well, right? And that weighs on you mentally. There's a limit of how much of these videos of police brutality and other things that I personally can do, right? People are sharing it like, you need to know. No, I don't. I already know. You needed to know. I already knew, right? I think about it every day, right? I don't speak. I try not to because I don't need any other reason to be pulled over for any reason. 1 in 3 black transgender youth have attempted to take their own life. What does it mean for a black transgender youth to not be accepted in their church, by their community, by their family, right? Or even in LGBTQ spaces that are supposedly inclusive of transgender persons, but there are a lot of those spaces that are still doing the work and not as inclusive as they need to be. What does it mean when you show up to an all-white space that says they support transgender youth and you're the only one that looks like you, right? That's why it's important that we consider the mental health consequences. 1 in 3 is ridiculous. We didn't even talk about homelessness yet among black LGBTQ youth. 95% of black LGBTQ individuals reported that discrimination has negatively affected their psychological well-being to some degree. They're not anomalies, right? When you're black, when you're LGBTQ, and you're in these United States, there's something going on. There is an attack on you, right? Some more than others, privilege, class, economic status, location, all comes into play. But when 95% of black LGBTQ youth are struggling or have mental health issues or discrimination, and it affects their mental health, that's a problem. That's a problem for all of us.
So when we look at black trans women specifically, Tara named some really troubling statistics, but for black trans women, some of the statistics really are even more troubling. We know that black trans women are killed at disproportionate rates because of the intersection of racism, transphobia, and sexism. We also know that black trans women experience domestic violence and homelessness at disproportionate rates. And I also want to add here that even though we have some statistics around what these numbers are, they're likely underrepresented because of misgendering in the media and lack of visibility for these community members. So we also know that black trans people in general are at higher risk for police brutality because of the intersection of their identities. So according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, trans people are almost 4 times more likely to experience police violence and 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with police. We also know that police shootings of unarmed black people in the US were 3 times higher than that of white people between 2015 and the beginning of 2020. So it stands to reason that people who are both Black and transgender are at significant disproportionate risk for police violence. And one example of the ways that Black trans people have been targeted is in New York. The anti-loitering law was shown to really disproportionately affect trans women of color. So many transgender individuals feel pressure to conform to societal expectations about what it means to be masculine or what it means to be feminine. And I think trans people of color feel additional pressure because of the expectations and the already existing negative perceptions of people of color. And Tara actually brought this up in a meeting we had, that notions of femininity and masculinity are strongly tied to race. So lightness and whiteness is often associated with femininity, while darkness and lightness is associated with masculinity. And we also know from studies that Black men are perceived to be more masculine than white men are. And I think I've experienced some of this pressure firsthand. I think because I identify as a Black man, I've felt immense pressure to conform to the societal expectations of what that means and the societal expectations that come with that. And that means excluding a lot of things that I may actually enjoy doing, like painting my nails, because that's not what Black men do. And while visibility for the LGBTQ plus community, especially for Black women and trans women of color, is increasing, there's not much in-depth coverage of the day-to-day struggles of LGBTQ plus people of color, especially low-income people. And often when there is visibility, it's not good or accurate visibility.
Okay. Before I go a little bit deeper into Black people and the church experience when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues, does anyone else have another question at this time or comment perhaps? Yes?
I wanted to make a comment on one of the slides you had earlier. One thing about this is that we as a Black community got to take responsibility for ourselves. We cannot continue to look outside of our community for what we need. We have to be fully accepted, because we're not. And before we can expect for white people to accept and embrace, we got to first accept and embrace ourselves, and we don't. So I think that it needs to start at home. We need to support each other. We need to find our tribe, find our communities, find our people that accept us, and become a more fortified group as the LGBTQIA group or community. We need to self-fortify first, and then look outside.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree. I think in my role as chapter coordinator at PFLAG, I had a mom come to me and say, "Where are all the Black parents?" You know, because PFLAG just happens to be a predominantly white space, and I didn't have an answer for that parent. I didn't know what to tell her. But I know they're out there because we said earlier, over 1 million people identify as Black and LGBTQ. And so, you know, we really have to come together as a community and be the change that we want to see. So yeah, that's kind of one thing I lament about the community, is finding people who look like me, who identify like me at those intersections has been incredibly challenging. And I think that's definitely something we can work on as a community.
I agree too, and that's what makes it a shame, because even when, in particular, I work with youth a lot, so when Black LGBTQ plus youth, you know, have to say, I identify this way, I'm thinking about this, I'm wrestling like this, and the last people they want to tell their own parents, that's a problem, that's a concern. Or when they are frequently being disowned and cast aside, right? I kind of hinted at in my own personal story that I grew up in, I think someone else used this term earlier too, a loving church, right? It wasn't a church of hate, but it also wasn't a church that was affirming. It also wasn't a church that was speaking out against injustice, right? So let's get a little bit into about Black people in the church. as it relates to LGBTQ plus issues. African Americans stand out as the most religiously committed racial or ethnic group in the nation. It's been that way for a long time, but the numbers are on decline as spirituality and organized religion here in these United States is actually on decline as well. But even in the midst of the decline, African Americans seem to be holding more steady, and that decline is slower as it relates to involvement and commitment to the church. Now, the majority, when we talk about Black persons in the church, actually belong to historically Black churches. That's a term used by Pew Research, I can't remember which organization, but I like this term because there are churches and denominations that are historically Black, such as AME, African Methodist Episcopal, AME Zion, and CME, some others, Missionary Baptist, and they are historically Black churches. These are where the majority of those who are Black and identify as Christian and faith leaders are a part of these Black spaces, which is beautiful to have that for your faith. But again, when we focus so much on the Black and not all, right, all of us who are Black, then that becomes a problem. Black people who are religiously affiliated are the group most likely to say clergy speak out about laws regarding homosexuality. So this means most churches are not like my church that I grew up in, where we just say nothing and hope it goes away maybe. But they are actively preaching and teaching and condemning homosexuality, right? Even though they're preaching to a congregation, again, to that statistic that likely has a number of Black LGBTQ adults and youth listening. If not them in person, someone else who knows, a parent, a child, a sister, a cousin, a friend, a coworker. And how are we preparing them to have these conversations? How are we teaching them to love when all they hear in church are messages, whether it's from the pulpit or elsewhere, that are condemning these laws about sexuality, particularly homosexuality? One unfortunate piece is that it leads to an erasure of some wonderful Black icons and representatives. Reverend Polly Murray, right? Marsha P. Johnson, Bayard Rustin, James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, people that are wonderful Black icons and representations and figures and activists for Black civil rights and great Black representation, who all, would identify as somewhere on the LGBTQIA spectrum, and we can't even call their names in church spaces and recognize what they've done because we can't uplift the LGBTQ people. Yes, ma'am.
I want to make sure I'm reading that last bullet correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you said,
Okay.
and if I'm hearing this right, is that this group, so the church overall,
Mm-hmm.
is actually speaking out for the laws for homosexuality, not against it, right?
Let me be clear about which laws.
The third one where
Yeah. Because it just says laws regarding homosexuality, but
I think what the research was saying was that the clergy was speaking out against laws in favor of homosexuality. So clergy members of Black churches were the group most likely to say homosexuality is wrong,
mm-hmm.
and that laws in favor of marriage equality should not pass.
right. They're more likely to hear sermons and messages too. I think from the Pew Research, that's how it was worded too. It was two-part. Yeah, they're more likely first to hear messages about homosexuality and laws in the church, but then secondly, they're more likely to hear messages and teachings that are against homosexuality, period. Thank you for that clarification. Sorry for the confusion. Yes, Mia.
So my question is, there are plenty of people who I know are staying in these types of churches because there's a cultural familiarity, mm-hmm. and they are not willing to sacrifice that cultural familiarity to say, come to Myers Park Baptist,
Right.
which we understand, both of us having grown up in Black church and coming here, and there is a sacrifice to leaving behind that familiarity. So how do we bring those people along? I mean, I find myself often as somebody who doesn't identify as LGBTQ, but who refuses to be a member of a church like that. I find myself looking at some friends and family like, how could you still be here? But not trying to judge, because I know, it's supposed to be, nice. But how do we bring them along in the conversation to say, hey, I know that this is comfortable, your family goes here, you grew up here, but how can you reconcile being here and also being a supporter of people who identify as LGBTQ and beyond?
Right. That is a great question. So the two things that come to my mind are, one, which you hinted at, the majority of Black persons who go to a church likely go to a church they grew up in or have familial, some kind of relationship with. It wasn't an intentional searching for a church. I personally am adamant in telling people, regardless of who you are, intentionally choose a church. Don't just go, it's great that your friend goes here. Ask what they believe. Look at the leadership. Ask what they believe. See what kind of things they're putting out there. Listen to the sermons. Don't just pick a church because that's a beautiful steeple. I like that. I like looking at that. But I think we have to work on teaching our people, Black and otherwise, to be more intentional about the spaces we occupy. And what does that mean? I get on people all the time, some of my own clergy peers that I know believe more in alignment with the liberation theology that I believe. And I have to ask them, did you ask who was going to be on this panel before you got on this panel? Because there's someone up there who's an outright racist and homophobe. Did you ask before you entered in that space where your name could be attached to? And they're like, I didn't think about it. I knew what I believed. I didn't think about what the person on the panel next to me believed. So all that to say, I do think there's some education, intentionality necessary there about where we choose to worship. I think we need to challenge people and ask them, why do you go here? What about what is being said or not being said, that explicit and implicit, right, that is drawing you? What is it that's beyond, this music sounds cute and cool, and it's pretty inside, right? I forgot my second point, but it was a good point. It was great. We believe that. Did you want to say anything to that question?
I think to that point, I also think some of it might be that churches that are not historically Black churches that are majority white, being open to asking people of color, what about the service can we do differently? And I think Myers Park, especially when we have like jazz services, before COVID we were in Heaton Hall, and occasionally there'd be jazz services, there'd be different genres of music, and I thought that was really interesting because not a lot of churches are willing to do that, are willing to break away from the hymnal, and that's something that can also help to sort of bridge that divide between, I really want to be a part of an affirming church, but I don't want to leave behind the music that's familiar to me. And so I think that's also part of it is, yes, asking people, what about this church is appealing to you, and then kind of helping to make some of those changes in new, faith communities.
I remember my second point, and then we had a question. So I saw your hand.
No, actually, I was going to piggyback on what you were saying. There's actually a lot of peer research that suggests some folks, especially like Catholics and people that are Jewish, see it more as an ethnicity than a religion. So even if you don't practice it, it is part of your family legacy. Right. You can't ever get away from it.
Right. So it goes a little deeper. The second point that finally came out of my mind is that, so Mia asked, specifically, I heard you use the language of how do we, bring them alongside. It's probably not going to be that, honestly, because, again, there is a general decline in organized religion participation just across this country. Right. And so it's not going to be a bringing them alongside. It's going to be a going to where they are. Right? Just because people are less likely to, I'll talk about Black people in particular, and I'm going to say millennials like my age, even though we are less likely to be a part of an organized faith group or church or religion, we're more likely to still have these very spiritual conversations around at brunch, at happy hour, after work, at the softball league when we meet up every week. So these conversations are still happening, even though they're not happening inside the faith space. And what I'm going to get to, I think, on the next slide is that we still have a lot of work to do about how we talk about these issues with one another, even in both spaces. If we're in Black spaces, we need to be conscious of how we talk about LGBTQ plus persons. And if we're in LGBTQ spaces that are mostly white, we need to be conscious about how we're talking about Black persons. The example I thought of is, one example I thought of is that it's still real prevalent, unfortunately, among people in general, but among Black persons to make the joke of, oh, so-and-so, did you hear so-and-so got arrested, they're going to jail, they're going to prison, don't drop the soap. What are we saying? Right? We're unconsciously, whether intentionally or not, tying sexual assault to someone who may not identify as straight. We're stigmatizing, right? And, you didn't say it's wrong to be gay. You didn't say, you're not straight, something's wrong with you. You didn't say those intentional things, But that's the language that people are casually talking about, the microaggressions, the real passive kind of conversations we have that are still very, very harmful to people, right?
Sorry, and I'll also, really quick, because I don't remember if we get to it, but just talking about the dissonance that can create in faith spaces, where we talked in our first plenary session about how connection to communities and support in communities really does save lives. And so to grow up in an environment where you're seeing people who look like you, but are also preaching sermons and saying things that are anti your community can really create that sense of dissonance. And I feel it all the time because I love listening to music from the Black church and music that resonates to my experiences. But it's also like, sometimes I look at like, is this person that like is singing this amazing song, The Homophobe, and I Google it and it turns out, yes, they are. And so it's like, I'm listening to this music and I'm like, but this music wasn't made for me. And that dissonance is really intense sometimes, to where it's like, sometimes I feel like I don't really belong anywhere. It's like, the Black church won't accept me because I'm trans, and a lot of white churches won't fully embrace me because I'm Black, and so it's like that dissonance is really powerful.
Yep.
I completely agree. When I first came out and was kind of going on my journey, there was a list of affirming churches, and I'm going to go to every single one of them, and it's going to be great. I'm finding them just like my home church, and I couldn't find one. I mean, I leaned over my friend at one point, and I'm like, "Where's the Hammond organ? Where's the shouting music? Where's the And I struggle with that. I do have a general question for you, though. I did a pastors' roundtable with Black pastors, and I asked them where they stood on LGBTQ inclusion. And all the pastors in the room were like, we love them, and we're here for them, but it's a sin. Yeah, that's what we believe. After the cameras got turned off, more than half the pastors came up to me and said, look, I said this publicly, this is how I personally feel, and I said, well, why didn't you say that publicly? And they said, well, we don't want to lose money, we're worried about legacy, reputation, we don't want to rock the boat. Most of our members are up in age, and we just don't want to lose money. What do you think is going to take for specifically black pastors, I mean all pastors, right? But Black pastors to shift, to make that change, to be open about how they feel privately. There's also the other issue of there being a lot of DL pastors.
Yes, indeed. I think it's a complex answer to answer yours about how do we shift, only because, to your point, there's a lot of complex reasons. Some is money. Some don't have the theological, educational wherewithal to actually deep dive and see what the Bible actually does say, right? Or to actually examine their own theology in a way that they can present a coherent case. Some people are just worried about ego and image, right, in front of their congregation. Some people are just lazy because it takes work, right? I've been working on a personal project that I hope to really develop one day, and I already got the title because it's called Get Them Ready. I'm tired of my peers, other Black clergy and pastors saying, my congregation, my people are not ready.
Right.
And then my follow-up, what are you doing to get them ready?
Right.
Because I found that the more I engage with people and tell my story and just ask these things, people are willing to ask questions. People are curious. But we don't give people enough credit. We talked a little bit in our small group a minute ago about that comfort in the black and white, right? People don't want to dig into the gray because it takes work to be in there and be okay with the gray. And I'm not saying the LGBTQ plus inclusion should be gray, right? But it takes some work to get there and dig into it. I remember specifically, I went to an HBCU for my first seminary degree, and it's an ironic contrast. Again, remember, Black people are not a monolith. One of my first classes with a Black professor had us, and my little innocent heart didn't even know what this was at the moment. One of my assignments was to write a case on why homosexuality was wrong. Right? I did my paper, I got an A. Oh, I hate that. Oh my God. I keep it on my Dropbox to remind myself of how far I've come in my own theological thinking. But That was what, 7 plus 7, 10, maybe 9, 10, almost 10 years ago now. Anyways, but it was that same seminary, maybe the year or two after, where I first learned the term pansexual, right? Different professor, different class, but that's where I first understood the term pansexual, demisexual, and all these other terms, intersex, and start learning about the frequency rate of someone being born intersex, right? So I'm to the point, me personally, I'm tired of people's excuses. The education is there, the resources are there, the internet is about everywhere now, right? We can do better, but we gotta want to do better.
Yeah.
And let me be clear, because I'm talking in this multicultural space, I'm talking to black people right now. Everybody else can do better too. We all have our issues and things to work on. So while the black church does have some work to do, because there are thankfully some black churches that I know are doing the work. I've talked to some pastors right here in Charlotte who have advocated and said, I was wrong before. I was wrong. Or they're taking steps to make sure their church is not just open, but also affirming, right? There are still some white churches that still need to do that work. They've done a great job on the LGBTQ side, but where is your black people in your leadership? Where are the black people on, your leadership, your elders, your deacon board? Where are the black people that get to make decisions? Where is the representation musically, right? Culturally, decolonizing worship? What does that look like? So there's still a lot of work to do. What were we talking about? All right, let's go to the next slide. Was there another question? All right. Said we would get here. In the African American community, newspapers, stories about HIV, AIDS receive the most attention, which can be problematic. So in some ways, yes, we're finally getting more black LGBTQ representation in media, TV, and even thinking about one of the local papers here. As soon as you put something about a black LGBTQ person, there's a good chance that it's going to be tied to HIV/AIDS, right? What is that saying? What is the stigma there, right? Not saying that this is not an important issue in the community, or if we think broadly, if it's important in one community, it should be important to all of us. But what are we saying that that's the only time we get the black male gay couple on the TV, the daytime or mainline TV show is now it's time for this very special episode about HIV and AIDS, right? What are we saying there? That's the only time that we bring up that representation. And I know Devin's going to talk a little bit about transgender representation as well. So, many critics, like Daryl James, criticize the feminization of the black man. We hinted at this a minute ago, right? There is this idea that any black person, particularly a black man who identifies or is too, quote, effeminate, right? That is bringing down black society, it's bringing down black men in particular, it's making us, quote, weak, which leads to a deeper discussion on why do you associate femininity with weakness? When the first person you would name as a strong person is probably your mom, right? Lewis Hop Kendrick claimed, one of many, that gay rights diverted attention from the plight of black America. Even today, there's still this contrast that people want to make of, if we're focused on LGBTQ, we'll get to the black thing later. If we're focused on black civil rights, we'll get to the LGBTQ thing later. I use TikTok and stuff now. I'm trying to keep up with my youth. I'll see someone comment here and question, particularly if it's a black creator, and they'll ask, another black person will ask this black creator, well, why are you worried about what those alphabets, right? That's one of those little kind of trying to be passive, but it's still homophobic terms, right? And I love the creators on TikTok, mostly Gen Z, that I follow, and I appreciate them because they respond quickly and say, the fact that you even said that is showing some kind of internalized misogyny, some hatred, some homophobia things there. But again, it leads to the erasure of that. We are not one or the other. There are black people who are LGBTQ. Hello, I'm here. Right? So that intersection, we cannot neglect that intersection. We cannot hear LGBTQ and first think of a black person, particularly a white person, particularly a white cis man. We can't hear black and assume that everyone in the black struggle or for the black cause automatically is straight or cis, right? Who are we leaving out of that narrative? I already mentioned my Bayard Rustin and Polly Murray, right? Wonderful advocates, activists, but when we say Marsha P. Johnson, and we're like, oh, but this is a black thing. Who are you erasing from that history? We talked about the church a little bit, gospel music. We wouldn't have black gospel music if it wasn't for James Cleveland, right? Meanwhile, you got Erica Campbell of Mary Mary, some of you may know who she is, whatever, or Diamond Perkins and others, or Kim Burrell, and the first thing they want to say in their little ad-libs as non-theologians is that demon of homosexuality, right? We can do better. But all these things are all intertwined, right? That's the whole point of what Devin has put together in his presentation. What we're trying to share is that there is indeed an intersection that cannot be ignored. And if you are for people, it needs to be for all people. You cannot be just for black people. You cannot just be for LGBTQ people, because guess what? Someone you know that's LGBTQ is black. Someone you know that's black is LGBTQ. We need to be for all people.
Really quickly, if I can just add two comments. So first is I think sometimes we operate, especially when we're talking about social justice, out of a scarcity mindset, that there isn't enough rights to go around, and that, you know, if this group gets to the finish line first, there won't be enough for me. And I think we really have to stop operating out of that sort of like capitalistic scarcity mindset and realize that, like, if we really try hard enough, there's enough for all of us. And I think the second point is sometimes I find myself with like this internalized, almost like want to call it like internalized racism, where I'm like, you know, certain things are like making black people look bad. And then I think to myself, but I say the same thing about white people. Like, would I say like this white person who said something out of pocket is making all white people look bad? And I wouldn't say that. So why am I saying the same thing about black people? I've heard that, like, I've heard people say like black LGBTQ plus people make the black community look bad. And it's like, well, you wouldn't say that about a white LGBTQ plus person, so why are the double standards there? So just two thoughts of that.
To that thought too, Devin, I just thought of, again, just recognizing the audience is mostly at least visibly appearing white persons. I think it's important for you all as your role too, is when you hear even, you know, you hear in your own communities or whatever that people, even if someone identifies as black, and you hear the disparaging for the LGBT community, it's not about, you know, this isn't my place to say anything. Sometimes it is. Homophobia is homophobia. But I think it's important for you all to recognize too, because that is rooted, it's still rooted in white supremacy. And I'm reminded of this Bell Hooks quote I'm going to share that from her book, We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity. Bell Hooks shows the concept of emasculization is often used, in particular by black men, to re-inscribe patriarchal order because black men who are the most worried about castration and emasculation are those who have been completely absorbed by white supremacist patriarchal definitions of masculinity. Yeah. It's a fear, right? It's a fear that happens in the black community often, that if we are, quote, or men in particular, black men, are emasculized, that to Devin's point, it hurts the community, right? But whose ideas of masculinity are we subscribing to then, right? White supremacy, patriarchal ideals. So it's all of our work, that's my point. It's all of our work to make sure that no matter the community, that homophobia is put down, that racism is put down, that xenophobia is put down, that all of it is addressed, because if it hurts a portion, it hurts all of us.
Yes.
Okay. These are just a few resources that Devin has compiled for you all, and we're happy to provide a few more if you'd like. How Can You Hear Me? It was on Hulu at one point. I'm not sure. It's probably on YouTube. Is a great video about the Black LGBTQ experience as well too. And there's some other resources for you. Okay. What other questions or comments do you have at this time?
This is my way of a comment. I'm just sometimes frustrated about folks who try to make the LGBTQ issue be something about, protecting children, as though there is a higher incident of child molestation or whatever, among LGBTQ folks. Even the bathroom bill was sometimes, talked about like men trying to sneak into women's, restroom.
Right.
So I'm just sometimes frustrated about that kind of way of looking at it.
And I think often we use really coded language to talk about like what we really mean. So we talked earlier about HB 755, and it's dubbed the parents, sorry, I'm blanking on it. But like parents' rights, right? And so like parents have a right to know, but it's really coded for, you know, where it's taking away agency from LGBTQ plus community members to self-identify and to have the agency to come out at the point that they're comfortable. And for me, I mentioned earlier that school was my first safe space. So it's like when you're dubbing this like parents' rights, it's like you kind of have to see between the lines.
And Morris brings a great point too about, again, that stigma that's pushed onto the LGBTQ community when the perpetrators of most sexual assault, sexual violence falls on cis men. That's just what it is, right? The people who are, quote, sneaking into bathrooms, if you're sneaking into a bathroom and you don't identify, then it wasn't the person who identified as that the issue. Am I right? Did somebody is admitting that if given the opportunity, they would sneak into a bathroom? Is that what you're trying to say? Is that your thought? I never thought I needed to sneak into a bathroom. Is that what you're thinking? But again, all those little things, right, where people try to code it, like protect the children from these terms, these gendered things in this gay. It's not a protect because we're not attacking them. We're equipping them with the tools to know that, yeah, your friend has two moms. Great.
And we also say that as if there aren't LGBTQ plus kids that are out there. Like protect which kids, you know, certainly not LGBTQ plus kids.
Yeah.
Are there any other thoughts or questions?
Good stuff.
This is a pastor, and I have to say this. With all of this is going on, and all of this about the church and the pastors not wanting to tell their people or progress their people, at the end of it all, we belong to God. We don't belong to a denomination. We don't belong to a congregation. We belong to God. And God never allows God's people to be forsaken. No matter what the laws do, no matter what the pastors do, no matter what happens in the land, God will have the last say.
Amen.
So as we continue to do the work that we are called to, let's remember who has called us and what we are called to do. And to know that if God be for us, then who can be against us? The work will happen. Whatever God wants to happen in this earth will happen. Let's just continue to make ourselves available to do it.
Amen.
I like that endpoint there because it does get frustrating. I think, we hear the laws, we see the changes, we know the people that do not have our best interest or anyone's best interest, their own best interest in mind when it comes to laws, politics, and things like that. But at the end of the day, there's work to be done. My Bible readers know that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few, which means those of us who identify as laborers have some work to do. I got to rhyme. But take that as if you don't take anything else today, know that you, I love how it was mentioned earlier in one of the sessions too, that you can do work where you are. You can do work where you are. If you know your space needs to be more inclusive and deal and confront whiteness, right, and address some racism, you can do that. If you know your space needs to address homophobia, you can do that. If you know you just got a myriad of things to work on, wherever it is that you already operate, where you already do have some form of position, power, or privilege, there's something that you can do because there is always someone who needs to see it, who needs to hear it, who needs to feel loved, and who needs to feel affirmed. And if we can do that, I think God will be pleased.
Amen.
Amen?
Amen.
Amen.